Hi, I'm Brad Helm, and I teach computer science and applied computer programming at Rend Lake College. Computer science focuses on higher order math and university level chemistry, physics, and biology to prepare students for careers assisting professionals in these and related fields, as well as for research and development in computational thought. Applied computer programming focuses on general business knowledge as well as specific methodologies, tools, and techniques which enable programmers to design and implement solutions to real-world problems. At Rend Lake College, we focus on Java and C++ for our computer science and engineering majors, and C# for our applied programming students. SQL, or SQL, is the main language we use for teaching databases like Microsoft Access and Microsoft SQL Server. For our browser-based applications, we use a combination of HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript. We also have some new classes coming out soon that focus on internet technologies like Node.js and React, and platforms like Amazon's web services. While all of this might sound fascinating and even cool, it can be daunting to think about how to get started in any of these areas on your own. While I don't have time today to demonstrate everything I've mentioned, I do want to walk you through a very simple database project students work on in their second semester. It's a little Rolodex application running on Windows computers. All right. And this is along the lines, too, of how we actually teach the classes, especially in the day of remote learning. We tend to do this video casting, screencasting, where I can actually demonstrate to the students what's going on and walk them through. And that way, if they have an issue, we can screen share what they have and take a look, and then everybody can learn from everybody's errors. So let's create a new project. And let's see. We're looking for a C# WinForms application. Next. And we're just going to call this Rolodex. For those who are younger than I, Rolodex was simply the flip card version of your contacts list. So yes, I am showing my age there. So we got a Rolodex. All right. And once we have the basic project up and running in the development environment, and we use Visual Studio 2019, we also use Visual Studio Code, Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, and we also use several products from JetBeans, including IntelliJ, CLion, and PyCharm for various applications. So the first thing we want to do is we want to download and install any libraries that we need. And it's become standard practice to use open source repositories, which are publicly accessible libraries to build our tools and build our applications with. So we're going to manage tools from one of these repositories called NuGet, and we're going to install Entity Framework Core. Originally, Entity Framework Core was a Microsoft in-house product, but they have since open sourced it. It is now available to be included pretty much Entity Framework itself and Entity Framework Core, which is the open source cross-platform version, are available to be utilized in most of our applications. Yes, I want to accept those. And there are several of these libraries that we want to install right off the bat. Okay, I need the tools. Accept. And while I'm at it, why don't I go ahead and grab, if I can find it, there it is, SQLite. And again, this is stuff that in the classroom, we actually go through in detail explaining what each library is, why we use them, what caveats to be aware of. We want to double check and make sure, yes, we do have our tools installed. All the Entity Framework Core stuff we need is there. So we can go ahead and close it. Now we need to create, let's add a folder. We talk about organizing our toolkits as part of the program. So let's set up something for models. A model is a logical model. And although we do teach both database first and code first forms of programming, I'm showing right here the code first form. And I'm just going to add a class to this. And it's going to be a file. Now the file is going to be called data classes, but I'm actually going to rename the stuff inside of it. All right, we're going to use, since we imported or included the Microsoft Entity Framework Core, we want to make sure that when we use those tools, we're actually telling our compiled program that we need to use that library. So we do that, and then we're going to have two different classes. Again, we're setting something up here that is very, very rudimentary. It's not necessary. This is just meant to introduce students to the idea of working with both a database context and also working with data classes, which kind of organize the information that we store inside the context. So let's call this our Rolodex context. And we're going to use the boilerplate that is provided in Entity Framework Core for a DB context or a database context. We also need a class that's going to represent a person, because when we deal with a Rolodex, we're storing information about an individual person. We need to put that in there. Now, Entity Framework Core and most of the libraries that we use have some convention associated with them. And with this, we can simply say, I'm going to use a public integer ID. And this will create what's called a primary key, so that if we do have related tables, we have what are called primary foreign key relationships. We can actually connect two tables together and not necessarily rely on information that might change. For example, if we used a person's last name and maybe their social security number, that could get to be a problem if the person changed their name, because then every link in every table would have to be changed. It's kind of a pain in the butt. So what we do is we use unique numbers primarily, and we call them ID keys. We call them primary keys and then foreign keys. So we also need to go ahead and put fields in to represent the individual pieces of information we're wanting to use. So for example, we want to store the last name, don't we? So we're going to store the last name as a string of characters. We're also going to store the first name and middle initial. And I tend to use this example because some people go by first name, last name. Some people use their middle name as a given name or a name to name of address. Some people have multiple middle names. Some people have hyphenated names. This is simply a kind of an easy way to put it all in one. Your needs may be something different, so you can always do something different as your needs dictate. We also want to keep track of phone numbers, right? So we're going to end up with a phone number that we're storing. We may as well go ahead and store email addresses as well, right? So we have email addresses, and we can store other information as we go through. We can store date of birth. If maybe we were setting up some kind of genealogical database, you might have date of birth, you might have date of death, might have location where they're buried, location where they got married. Yeah, all kinds of information that you could associate with it. Again, we're staying with something super simple to start with. And our Rolodex is going to have to keep track of the people we know. So it's going to have a set or a collection of these individual persons and we're going to refer to that as people. It kind of makes sense. And when we talk in terms of the plural, we rarely say persons, plural. I guess you would if, I guess, persons of interest or the like. But most of us say people. All right. So we've got that. And the only other thing we have to add to our data context is information about where to store the information as we save it. When we save it, we want to save it somewhere, write it out to a hard drive, save it to a server so that we can access it again at a later date. And we're going to use the onConfiguring routine to basically tell our options builder to use the SQLite that we added into our system. Now you notice it comes up and says there's a problem here. We get this little red underscore squiggly, I call it a squiggly line. But it's an indication that there's a problem. And let's see, it says no method, it has 0 arguments. So we actually have to give it a little extra information. Specifically, we have to tell it what the file is. And I'm going to call this my rolodex.dat. So what this will do is actually create a file with our executable program that will store all of the information. So as we run the program, we can edit it, we could scan through it, we could write reports off of it, whatever we needed. And whenever we save our program, we want to know that that particular file is where it's going to be stored all the time. Now, the data source could be different if you're hooking up to an internet database or a database on your local network. But again, it all comes down to setting up an information string like this, a connection string, and then letting the system do its connection. So right now we've got everything that is necessary to create a very simple Rolodex database file, including how it's supposed to store the data in there. So we're just going to build it really quickly. I say really quickly. Usually somebody has a typographical or a syntax error. They may have something that's not quite right. Again, this is the benefit of having a facilitator or a teacher working with you, because we can point out the errors and point out what to look for early on, and things that might confound you can be resolved fairly quickly. Now, as we see by looking at this bottom corner, we see no issues found. So we should be ready to go ahead and take the next step. And the next step is going into the Package Manager console. And this is another part of the Entity Framework Core toolkit that since we've added the Entity Framework Core, we have a couple of new commands that we can issue. Add migration. And a migration is simply a code, we call them code migrations. It is when you move from one version of your software to another version of your software, whether you're talking a major version like going from Windows 7 to Windows 8 to Windows 10, or maybe you're going from Windows 8 to Windows 8.1 or that sort of thing. You can even have individual build numbers. So when you're programming, you don't necessarily put everything that you write out to be used. Sometimes it's code that you're using to test out theories. And if it works, great. If it doesn't work, that's fine too, because it just shows you one way that you will not end up implementing your code. So when I say I want to add a migration, I can also add some text to this to kind of describe it. And this is my initial build of the program. So I'm just going to call it the initial build. When I add the migration, provided I did everything right, the tools will automatically create the code necessary to actually create the file we needed. And now that I have that migration, then I can use the command update database, which connects to my database that I've defined. here are my data classes. It's going to connect to that file using that driver, and it's going to try to talk to it. And it's going to pass those migration codes to update the database from where it was, which for our project was non-existent. It's going to now update it to where, hey, we've got a table with people in it. And again, at any one of these steps, there could be problems that crop up. And while you can use Google to find those problems and find answers to the problems, sometimes you may have to go through 3, 4, 5, 6 pages of Google responses before you find the applicable remedy to the problem that you've got. As it is, mine said the migration was applied. Again, it's that initial build that I typed in. I said, this is my initial build. We've got a date and time stamp up here in front, which lets us know exactly when this migration was created. And it came back and said done. So everything went fine. At this point, I should have a file that I can add to my project as an existing item. And again, you only have this happen when you are creating a local data file. There's my Rolodex.dat, the name of the file that I said I was creating. I'm going to add that. And I need to change the properties on it because I want to make sure that whenever I change it, if I make a newer version of it, I want it to distribute that newer version with the program I've created. So there we go. So at this point, we've created the data context, data classes, created the actual physical file or connected to the database server to create the database and created the database. And we've made sure that that connection is active in our project. So we've done the behind the scenes stuff. Now we're ready to actually create part of our project. And we start off, because it is a Windows program, obviously a Windows program is going to have a Windows form pop up. And I'm going to show you some of the drag and drop tools, the code generation tools that are available in Visual Studio, but be aware that these tools have limitations. And we also train students to know what those limitations are, to know how to work within those limitations. And in several cases, we learn how to get around them. So what we need to do is we have our data class, and we need to tell our project that it's actually going to be a source of data for our project. So we click on the add new data source and say, yes, it's an object. Entity Framework Core is what we call an ORM, or Object Relational Model. And as it's an object-oriented tool, we choose object as the source for the data. And it'll ask us, where do you want to find it? And you actually will dig down and you can say, well, there's my models folder where I created, and there's the name of the class, each individual person. So I want to be able to display the person's information or multiple people's information. Click OK. And we see that we now have the person class that we created, and we have the information necessary to put those fields on screen. Now, we could either do it in detail view, which means that everything would be put on individual fields, kind of like flipping through that old Rolodex, one card at a time, or as what is more likely, especially if we're doing this as a desktop application, you're probably used to seeing something like spreadsheets, right? Microsoft Excel. So we'll actually use the data grid view. And what we're going to do is we're just going to drag that over and drop it on. And again, what's going on right now is, because of the steps we're taking, create the classes that define how we store our data. Create the class that defines how we are going to connect to the driver, or in this case SQLite, that's going to actually retrieve the data for us. Then we tell it we're creating a data source so that we know, oh, this is to be treated like a data source. And that way, when we drag and drop them over onto our forms, It creates not only the visual controls that we would expect, but also non-viewable controls like a binding source, which is what actually connects the on-screen fields to the individual fields in a particular person's entry. Now, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, let's see, how about we just dock that in the parent container, because we may as well have it be that size. And I really don't want that primary key, the ID field. I don't want it to be visible. In other words, I want to hide it. And let's see, last name, I could probably change it. Instead of 100 pixels wide, let's make it 150. First name, we can do the same thing, 150. Phone number, generally, at least in the US, we've got what, 3-digit prefix, maybe a hyphen, 3-digit, well, actually then it's area code prefix, and then the dialing number. So you're talking 10 to 12 characters. We should be fine at 100 characters, but email addresses, we could actually have people that have really funky email addresses. So maybe we change that to 200 characters in width. We click OK, and we can see that our grid is already expanded to show those particular fields and those sizes in this particular order, and we can reorder them if we want. Now, what I'm thinking for this project, because I want to keep it super simple, you open it up and you need to be ready to make changes if you're going to make changes. And as soon as you close your program, save whatever changes you made. Keep it simple, you know. So I don't really need to see the save button. I don't really need to see the delete button. And I don't really need to see the add button. And the reason is that the data grid functions kind of like a spreadsheet, where you just add another line, you're adding a new record. You can actually click on the front of the line and select the whole record and then delete it. So it is very, very similar to what people already know working with spreadsheets. This is part of the aesthetic design that we teach regarding application user interfaces, that you want to make sure that your programs don't necessarily look as flashy as can be, don't necessarily do things differently. You really want your software, especially in a business model, to be easy to use, almost brainless to use. You want somebody to be able to just look at your program and know what they need to do and do the job. Not only does that make it easier on them, it also makes it easier on you. You don't have to train them on how to use your software. So once I made those changes and I clicked off of the tool strip up there, notice they disappeared. So we're just about ready, but we need to add a couple of routines to the form itself. And the two main events that we want to deal with right here are, when the form is loaded, we want a startup routine. So I'm just going to create a routine called startup. And while I'm at it, when the form is closing, well, it's not closed yet, but when you click the little close button or you start shutting it down, you want to do a shutdown routine. And again, this is just a little technique where we create what are called event handlers. And when you do object-oriented programming, especially with user interfaces, we tend to think in terms of event-driven programming. The idea that an event, somebody clicks a button, a network message comes across. Maybe if you're playing a game, the force feedback controller starts vibrating on you. These are the different kinds of things that you want to think about as events. And then when you write code, these are the codes that when the event happens, that's how they respond. Now, we need to have something for this whole form, because the whole form is going to be dealing with the database at one time. So we're going to have this. We're going to have this public, and what did we call it? Rolodex context, and we'll just call it context. This creates a variable that we can then use throughout our project. In our startup, when we start up, we actually want to make a connection to our database. So our context equals a new Rolodex context. In other words, create a new connection to that database. Now, we're wanting to load the information about the people. So with that data context, we connect to the people table and we load, well, provided I type things right, and we load the data. And what that does is it reads the data from the database into a locally cached copy or an in-memory copy that then we can work with. And we now need to connect that in-memory copy of the data to those controls, or more precisely to the binding source, which then will connect them to the controls for us. Again, benefits of some of these automated tools, if we use them correctly, we don't have to do quite as much work, quite as much hands-on code. So to do that, we have our people, did I say that? Or is it person? Probably person binding source. Person binding source, data source equals, and we're going to tell it that we're going to, for the data, the source of the data that we're going to use on our form that we're binding our controls on screen to, we're going to go to that context. We're going to go to the people. And what we want to do is we want to use that loaded data, which is now stored locally in the local section. And we want to create this as a binding list, which is just a way of saying that the objects in memory need to be maintained until such time as they're going to be sent back out to the data file. So when the program starts up, it connects to the database, loads the people into a local piece of information and a local chunk of memory, and connects that to the on-screen controls through the binding source. Again, when we shut down, we want the program to automatically save the changes. We don't want to have to ask somebody, do you want to save changes? We could, and as you get more complex projects, you may decide that you need to ask, hey, you've got some unsaved changes. Do you want to save these changes, or you want to get rid of them? I'm sure you've seen programs that do this. Microsoft Word, Excel. Anytime you're working on a document, we'll try to do that. So we're going to take this shutdown and we're simply going to tell it that we want to save the changes to our database context. Now you might be thinking, that's not a lot of code. It's not a lot of code, but we're also not doing a lot of checking, error checking. We're not trying to add any kind of bells and whistles. This is very, very, very simple. But let's see if it works. Now I should be able to, by the way, they use a little start button. It's kind of like a multimedia. You start the movie, you can pause the movie, you can stop the movie. They use those kind of controls for the idea of compile and run the program, pause the program while it's running, or stop the program from the development environment. But that's all it is. So we've got our little table right here, and I tend to use the Smith family, Bubba, Bobby, and Billy. That is my demo people. Bubba's the oldest. He goes first. I'm not going to worry about a phone number for him. And I just move down, use the arrow keys to just move up and down and around through here. Again, just like a spreadsheet. Let's try Smith, Billy. And we have Smith, Bobby. All right, so we've got our three, and we could have email addresses in there. Maybe Bobby has an email. And he may have the Smith domain and just didn't tell his brothers. I have a brother. Imagine that. So we've got our data in there now. If I did my job right, I close that and I run it again. It should open up the exact same file with the exact same data. So we just made a persistent database, something that was able to save our data and run it. Now, I don't even have to run it from there. I can actually go ahead and close Visual Studio down. I should have probably found where it was stored in memory or on my hard drive first. Let's see. This is under... And let's see if I remember right, it's under source, repos. There's my Rolodex folder. And if I look underneath the Rolodex project in the bin folder, this is actually where the executable program resides. And if I run it right here, lo and behold, I have all my data. So you can actually use examples like this. And this is one of the first programming examples when we get to the second semester and are working more with databases. First semester classes, we tend to work more with getting familiar with the Visual Studio IDE, the integrated development environment. We get familiar with the syntax. Most people who come in may have a little bit of JavaScript under their belt, and it's somewhat similar, but it's not identical. So we tend to take people the first semester as if they've never touched a computer before and go with it from that standpoint. First semester, we introduce them to object-oriented programming, basic programming techniques, the integrated development environment, basic troubleshooting, event-driven programming. Second semester, we start adding in database functionality using Entity Framework Core. Third semester, we go ahead and we add on and we make even more complex database applications, add additional report systems to it, integrate with web-based systems using the same Entity Framework Core libraries and tools. Then generally the fourth semester, we have an advanced web development class, which kind of ties everything together underneath the Microsoft banner in web development, desktop development, mobile development. We also are teaching a 4-semester sequence with HTML, CSS, JavaScript in the first semester. We're looking at several frameworks. React is one that we're looking at right now for the second semester for more advanced web-based, browser-based user interface design. Then the last semester we get into Node.js, server-side programming in environments that are more familiar for high scalability, such as the Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, even Google Web Services. We are moving in that direction. We have a 4-semester sequence that also helps students with more general business topics. We've got introduction to business and introduction to accounting, both of which are essential because the majority of our students do enter into some type of business environment. And to be honest, the accounting principles do relate well to all database programming. So it's worth knowing. Some general education classes as well. So that's pretty much an example of what we go through. And if you have any questions, or if you would be interested in either pursuing a degree in computer science or computer programming here at Rend Lake College, please contact our Applied Science and Technology Division and ask. I'm more than happy to talk to you myself, or one of our, either our dean or our administrative assistant will take care of getting you connected with the right people. So with that, have a good day.